Thanks for coming today. I'm Rochelle Diamond. I'm on our employee experience team. I run our speaker series. And you may know the speaker series is all about bringing inspiring ideas and innovative thinkers to our employees and our members to make them more productive and successful. You can always watch all of our not old, but other speaker series at speakers.linkedin.com. And we also have them all on iTunes too, so you can download them and listen to them there. So we have a great event for you planned today. Ryan Holiday is here. He is a strategist and a writer. He actually dropped out of college at 19 to apprentice with Robert Greene, who wrote the 48 Laws of Power. And he went on then to become the director of marketing at American Apparel. He's written 4 books. His last one, some of you may know it, The Obstacle is the Way. It's been translated into over 17 languages worldwide and has a cult-like following among NFL coaches, professional athletes, politicians, TV personalities, and I have since found out with a lot of LinkedIn employees too. I've heard from a lot of people how excited they are to have him here today. So his most recent book is Ego is the Enemy, and that's what he's going to be talking to you all about today. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage Ryan Holiday.
Thank you. How's everyone doing? Good? All right, well, we'll just get into it. So typically I start my talks with this question, right, which is, who the hell is this person? Rochelle did a very nice job introducing me, but I sort of go through it. So this is me in college. I was 19. I dropped out to work for an author. I really wanted to be a writer. That was my dream. And I sort of thought the way that you become a writer is you study under a writer. So I worked for Robert Greene, who wrote the 48 Laws of Power. I worked on a number of his books with him, sort of learning the craft of what writing is. And then through Robert, I came on as a strategist at a company called American Apparel, which is at the time one of the biggest fashion companies in the world. By the time I was maybe 21 or 22, I was the director of marketing. And then I wrote my first book while I was there, which is sort of an expose of the media system, just to sort of show you maybe how ego can go to an author's head, right? This is the picture of me in college, and it somehow becomes the cover of the book, which makes me look much cooler than I actually look. The pen becomes a cigarette, and then there's a monster, I guess, and all these things. So anyway, so I read my first book, does really well. It's got my face on the cover. Things are going well. I read another book a few years later, which also did well. And then I'm still at American Apparel, and the wheels start to come off a little bit, both for me and for the company, right? This is probably the nicest headline that you could find about Dove and American Apparel, an abrupt fall from grace. It ends up he's fired by the board of directors. There's a hostile takeover. It fails. A lot of controversial media about it. The company ends up going bankrupt twice. The 10,000 employees that work there no longer have jobs. It's sadly a kind of a timeless story, right? Really high-flying, successful company suddenly isn't so high-flying and successful anymore. Lots of people, again, historically this happens, right? You've got John DeLorean, brilliant engineer, inventor. You might have seen the car in Back to the Future. He actually tries to invent like the Tesla model of disrupting the major car makers. He makes on paper a great car, but actually the DeLorean would be like the worst possible car you could own. Not only does he run the company in the ground, but then at its sort of lowest point, he thinks that he can sort of he thinks he can refund the company with a $50 million cocaine deal. It's actually an FBI sting. It does not end well, as you can imagine. Of course, you've got Richard Nixon, right? He wins re-election in a landslide. He can't stop attacking what he sort of refers to as his enemies. He ends up overreaching. My favorite part is look just how big his head is. It almost looks like it's like photoshopped onto his body. Howard Hughes, another sort of brilliant strategic mind, an inventor, sort of a courageous, bold aviator. But actually, Hughes Aircraft is one of the worst-run companies in history. He makes so much money because of some of the patents and sort of monopolies that he has that he's able to fail over and over and over again. We sort of see in Howard Hughes a trajectory of what ego can do. I'll sort of present this one without comment, but maybe we're seeing some of the same that we're seeing. Maybe history repeat itself again. But so anyway, so this is the sort of timeless problem of ego as you become more successful, as you start to achieve the things that you're setting out to achieve. We often become our own worst enemy. Cyril Connolly, one of my favorite writers, he has this line, he says, ego sucks us down like the law of gravity. And so what I wanted to talk about today is the way that that happens, and of course, how maybe we can resist this gravitational pull so we don't fail so catastrophically. These are some notes. I was actually at American Apparel when all this sort of stuff was happening. And I remember I was in the parking lot with my editor, and we were talking on the phone, and it just sort of came to me this phrase, the idea that ego is the enemy. And not only is it the enemy, but that wherever we happen to be in life, and I would say that we're in sort of one of three phases at any given point. We're either aspiring to do something, we're achieving success in some way, or we're experiencing failure and adversity. And so the idea is that ego is the enemy of each one of these phases. And so a book starts as an idea, and then it becomes sort of you sort of backfill in all the material. So this is the breakthrough in the book. So we're either aspiring, we're succeeding, or we're failing. So we're at one of these three phases, and we're sort of going back and forth between them all the time. We succeed at something, and then we aspire to do something more. We fail at something, and then we have to aspire again, right? We succeed at something, and then we bring failure to that, or we experience adversity because of something we've done, and it goes on and on and on. And so we'll start with aspiring. I think the first way you sort of combat ego when you is early on, right? Ideally, you want to nip this sort of stuff in the bud. You want to prevent ego from taking root too early. And I think part of the way that you do that is by taking what they call in the martial arts the beginner's mind, or the student mindset. The story I tell to illustrate this is the story of a heavy metal guitarist. This is him here, Kirk Hammett. He's in a band called Exodus. They're an okay metal band. And then he's chosen to replace, actually they're a San Francisco heavy metal band at the time, he's chosen to replace a guy named Dave Mustaine in a band called Metallica. Metallica is still an underground band at the time. They're definitely going places. This is like being drafted, let's say maybe into the minor leagues at the time, but you've got a very clear path to the majors. And what does he do? Does he celebrate? Does he go out and buy a nice car? Does he party? No, what he does is he hires a guitar teacher. He hires a musician in Berkeley named Joe Satriani, who himself would go on to be one of the greatest guitar players of all time. And they work for almost 2 years. Even though he's a professional musician, he has a guitar teacher. And what Satriani would say is that Hammett was pretty good, but what he'd never really learned how to do was connect everything together. So it was this sort of process of he would get homework, he would have to go work on the homework, and he would have to come back having practiced those lessons each and every week. Satriani actually says to him, like, look, if you don't do the work, don't bother coming back. And so here we have someone submitting to this sort of master-apprentice model, or submitting to the student mindset at early on enough in his career that it's preventing ego from taking hold. And this is what you do. Working for Robert Greene, it's a similar thing for me. There's nothing I could do that would ever really impress Robert in any major way, because he'd already done all this before. So at best, you're getting a sort of good job. And then you've got to go, it's this sort of measuring yourself against someone who's so far in advance of you that it's inherently humbling, and it's preventing ego from coming through. Epictetus is saying, look, it's impossible for a person to learn that which they think they already know. So one of the problems early on in a career or in a job or in a trajectory is we think we're really good. And as a result of this, that's about as good as we end up becoming. So when you think you know everything, in some ways you're right, because you don't learn anything more. Socrates, right, is considered to be very wise because he knew what he didn't know. So this is the idea. You take the student mindset, you're perpetually a student. It's preventing ego from taking hold. The mixed martial arts pioneer Frank Shamrock, his training system is actually based on this idea. He calls it plus, minus, equal. So you want to train under someone who's much, much better than you. You want to challenge yourself against someone who's as good as you, and then you're also passing these lessons on to someone who's not as good as you. And it's sort of the interplay of all these different angles of the same material that inherently humbles you. And Emerson is saying, look, in every person that you meet, there's something that you can learn from them. And so focusing on this, right, not on how much you know, not on how good you are, this keeps you humble, this keeps you learning, and it's sort of perpetually teaching you things. The physicist John Wheeler, he says, as our island of knowledge grows, so too does the shoreline of ignorance. And so the point is, as you're learning more and more, what you're actually exposing yourself to is all the things that you didn't know that you didn't even know. And so this student mindset, you can keep it going all the time, and ego can never really take hold. Ben Franklin, early in his career, sort of illustrates this idea. He runs away at 18 from Philadelphia. He goes to Boston, and he comes home from Boston, and he thinks he's basically the shit, right? He thinks he's the best. He's made a little money for the first time in his life. There's this, actually, it's even embarrassing. A couple hundred years later, he would carry the coins that he'd earned in Boston around, and he would show them to people. So he's really proud of what he's done. And he's back. He comes back to Boston, he comes back to Philadelphia, and he sees his family, and he's talking to his brother. And doing the same thing, and his brother's just sort of shaking his head. This is really embarrassing and mortifying. And then Franklin goes on and he meets with Cotton Mather, who's one of the most prominent citizens in the town. And they're walking along this hallway, and Franklin's sort of really high on himself. He's really excited. He's sort of so caught up in this performance that he doesn't hear Mather when Mather says to him, stoop. And then he says, stoop again, and Franklin keeps walking. And then he runs right into a ceiling beam. He just hits his head really hard. And what Mather says to him, I think, encapsulates why ego is so dangerous at this early part in a career. He's saying, look, if you don't hold your head up so high, if you stoop from time to time, you'll save yourself a lot of painful bumps on the head. And so the point is, you can start to, early on, as when you sort of deserve it least, is when you start to feel really full of yourself. I went to this good school. They chose me to work at this great company. I'm making all this money. I'm doing this that my parents never could have done. I'm doing this more than any of my friends could ever do. And then what you do is you run smack into something that you weren't looking out for, right? You're so high on yourself that you bump into something. And so in Christianity, of course, right, we have the idea that pride goeth before the fall. And the idea is that if you're looking down on other people, you're not seeing what's above or around you. This is a famous Caravaggio painting. This is actually David slaying Goliath. And what you can't see, and I don't have a pointer here, but actually engraved on the hilt of the sword is a Latin acronym for the saying, humility kills pride. And so the idea is that if you think that you're the best, if you think that you're invincible, if you think you've got it, someone that you're not paying attention to is going to come and hit you with a stone and then cut your head off, is the idea. Not to get too morbid. So the idea is that humility kills pride, and the earlier you kill it, the better that you are. Theogonists, so this is obviously a theme that goes back even before the Bible. The first thing, Kurnos, which gods bestow on those they would annihilate, is pride. Cyril Connolly, again, he says, whom the gods wish to destroy, they first call promising. So it's at this point when you think that you're the hot shit, that you are actually preventing and sort of stilting your growth at this early period, and that's what you don't want to do. And then, of course, so let's say you do conquer ego in some way early on in your career, or let's say you're so talented that it almost doesn't matter, right? People put up with your shit because you're so great. You're chugging away. Well, what happens then is ego becomes a new problem while you have success. It immediately endangers that which you have achieved. So Pat Riley, the basketball coach, he calls this the disease of me. People don't really understand that in World War II, we think there's all these great generals. We don't realize, sort of gets lost in history, the way that all these really sort of powerful alpha males were constantly jockeying for power with each other. There's sort of one general who doesn't do this. This is George Marshall. Truman would say, never did Marshall think about himself. He's sort of the sort of trademark humble soldier. And he does quite a bit. He's the opposite of what you might compare sort of MacArthur to, who I think coincidentally is Trump's favorite general. But MacArthur was this sort of meticulously manages his image. He's always smoking this ridiculous corncob pipe that he thinks makes him look like a soldier. He's actively managing his public relations. He loves to do these big, bold moves. And he's constantly jockeying for power. But Marshall really does none of this. Famously, Marshall actually turns down the opportunity to command the troops at D-Day. FDR says to him, look, you haven't had a chance. This is yours if you want it. And he says, look, don't take my feelings into account. Sort of do what's best for the team. And so you'd think that this sort of making these decisions throughout your career to be constantly sort of turning down honors, to be turning down rank, sort of not jockeying for power. MacArthur actually treats Marshall pretty horribly early on in Marshall's career. He sort of banishes him to some obscure posting. This is the disease of me, right? As Riley is saying, it can strike any winning team in any year at any moment. But so MacArthur really treats Marshall quite terribly. And then at some point during the Second World War, the tables turn, and now Marshall is MacArthur's boss. So what does he do? Does he take his revenge? Does he sort of try to get even? Or does he think, actually, MacArthur might be a flawed person, he might be a complete asshole, but he's what we need right now in this very specific instance. So he sort of turns this down as well, he turns down this opportunity as well. Famously, what I love about my favorite Marshall story is he's forced to sit for this official portrait at one point, and he sits for several days for this painting. Then the artist says, okay, you're good to go. And he just gets up and leaves, and the artist says, don't you want to see the painting? And he says, like, no, I don't need to. Basically, he just wanted to get back to work. He had no interest in seeing a picture of himself. And so he does all this, and so you might think, of course, that this sort of constant spurning of attention, of recognition is going to hurt you over the course of your career, but in fact it doesn't. Oh, this is sorry, I forgot this. This is Cheryl Strayed. You're becoming who you're going to be, and so you might as well not be an asshole. But I know this is one of Reed's favorite quotes, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, who am I? But when you actually look at what Marshall's able to accomplish, it's not, it has no effect in the long term. This sort of constant spurning of ego has no negative effects over the long term. You know, he's chief of staff of the U.S. Army during the Second World War. He's the Secretary of State. He's the envoy to China during the Truman administration. He's the president of the American Red Cross and the Secretary of Defense. So his tombstone, I think, says it all. He, instead of focusing on what's going to get him attention, instead of focusing on accumulating power, he's focused on doing the work, right? He's focused on, there's a John Boyd, who's one of my favorite military strategists. He had this speech, he would say, to be or to do? Do you want to be an important person, or do you want to do important things? And that's what Marshall is choosing over and over again. He's choosing to do important things at the cost of recognition, at the cost of his own ego. But in the end, it adds up in a much more impressive way to all these other people. And it doesn't matter that most people don't recognize his name, right? You might think that's sort of a downside, but of course, Marshall's not alive, so this is not a complaint of his. What matters is the legacy that he left behind. The things that he did were so much more impressive than the other people who sort of felt like they needed to get what's theirs. I think one of the problems is, like, we know that humility is where we want to end up, but we don't think it's going to get us where we want to go. We think we need, like, in the beginning or the middle of our career, we've got to sort of get what's ours. We've got to give into this disease of me. But in fact, in the long run, this actually diverts us from where we want to go. And I think what you do then, instead of measuring yourself by these external measures, you use what's called the inner scorecard. Warren Buffett, he says it's very important to live your life by an inner scorecard, not an outer scorecard. And clearly, again, in someone like Buffett's case, it adds up in the end to actually an incredible amount of accomplishments. But he's thinking long term. He's thinking almost like in value investing, but he's thinking about this in his own life. So instead of measuring yourself by what other people think, you're measuring yourself by how you think. And part of the way that this suppresses ego, especially when you become increasingly successful, is that you don't see yourself how other people see you. You see all the things that you could or should be doing better, not all the things that you've done well. So you take the New England Patriots. This is Tom Brady's draft card from 2000. He's taken in the 6th round, the 199th pick in the NFL draft. He doesn't really look like Tom Brady now either. He's probably in better shape today than he was then. But considering what Tom Brady goes on to do, he's probably the best draft pick in the history of football, maybe even the best draft pick in the history of sports. I mean, to take a guy that's going to win 4 Super Bowls, I think 3 Super Bowl MVPs, he's thrown for 60,000 yards, he's built one of the greatest franchises in the NFL. To do all this as a 6th round pick, he originally joins the Patriots as their third string quarterback. So to do all this is incredibly impressive. And so you'd think he might be super proud of himself, and you'd think that the organization, the Patriots, would be very pleased with this sort of massive steal that they got away with, that they picked Tom Brady in the 6th round. You'd think this says how awesome they are. But in fact, they actually see it as a disappointment, right? Because what they see is that they let Tom Brady go all the way to the 6th round. So they remember who they picked in the 5th round, which is this guy, Dave Stachelski, who I'm sure is a very nice guy, but he doesn't even make it out of training camp. And in fact, the director of personnel for the Patriots, he actually keeps a picture when he was with the Patriots. He's now moved on, but he would actually keep a picture of Stachelski on his desk as a reminder of how narrowly, he went into the 2000 draft convinced that Dave Stachelski was much better than Tom Brady, and that he was worth getting in a round earlier than Tom Brady. And the Patriots also think about this, that if Brady hadn't proven himself in training camp, he wouldn't have been the 2nd string quarterback. So he manages through hard work and effort to go one level higher. But then if Drew Bledsoe hadn't gotten hurt, they might not have ever known what they picked. So this is a reminder that what they're actually finding is the failure inside their success. So they're looking at success and not saying, look how awesome we are, look how amazing we are. They're saying, look at how narrowly we avoided missing the greatest draft pick in sports. Elizabeth Noel Newman, she's a great sculptor. She's saying, I never look back except to find out about mistakes. I only see danger in looking back at things that you're proud of. This is a page from The Little Prince. He's saying, vain men never hear anything but praise. So this is the problem with ego, is that ego doesn't look at a situation and say, look at how easily this could have gone the other way, look at what we did wrong. It only sees the good things that it says about you. And so this is very dangerous, of course, not because it changes the past, but because it has the ability to change the future. I hope it doesn't look like I'm coming to LinkedIn to trash Google. I gave this a version of this thing at Google, but Google is a great example of some, obviously a very successful company, but an example of how this way of thinking can be problematic and how ego can sort of lead you astray, right? So Larry Page gave a talk at a conference a number of years ago, and he's saying, look, my metric is that when I'm looking at a company or a project, I go, does this have the potential to change the world? And this seems very inspiring and seems awesome. Of course, Google has changed the world, so this might seem like the metric to measure themselves against. But of course, that's actually not how Google was successful. Google starts as a graduate thesis. It's just 2 guys trying to finish this paper so they can get a good grade. That somehow becomes Google, right? So they had no idea that it was going to be this multi-billion-dollar search engine. They just thought it was a paper. YouTube, of course, not only didn't set out to disrupt television, it started as a dating site. So this is the first video ever uploaded to YouTube. So for some reason, the founder thought that a video of him with some elephants would make him attractive. So the point is, you can very easily tell yourself a story about your success that imbues it with a certain amount of certainty and awesomeness and genius and vision that wasn't actually there. And then what this does is it affects how you look at opportunities in the future and how you look at yourself in what you're doing. So, of course, Google Glass starts out as this ambitious, world-changing project, and they take it so seriously, they invest in so much that it actually creates a backlash. And then you're looking, I compare this to, say, Snapchat, which launches the same product, but kind of as like a fun joke. And so the difference between starting small and starting as this ambitious, world-changing thing can actually, I think, cause problems. Paul Graham has a great line. He's saying, the way to do really big things is to start with deceptively small things. And I think that's the way that you look at ego. Says, I'm setting out to change the world. I'm going to be on the cover of all these magazines. I'm going to do this, maybe a billionaire. I'm going to do all this stuff. But I think what a more humble approach is to start with the smallest possible thing that you could start with, sort of follow the process. You're sort of checking the boxes off one by one. And you want it to go in a good direction, obviously, and it can go in a good direction, but you're not giving yourself credit for this sort of genius and vision in advance. And that helps you do the deceptively small things much better than if you see them as deceptively insignificant small things. They are important because they're right there in front of you. And then, so let's say you do launch Google Glass and it fails. Well, now you're at the third phase, right? This is failure, and you're having to look at why you failed, why you're experiencing difficulty, and you're having to rebuild in some way. Things turned out to be harder than they were. So this is the next phase. I guess we'd call this the final phase. I think one of the hard parts is, we tend to, if we tell ourselves that our success says something about us as a person, the problem then is that when we go through something negative, we think that says something about us as a person. And of course, all of these are just in different states, as the Stoics would say. These are just different places that we occupy along a spectrum. So, right, transformation is a big thing here at LinkedIn. The Greeks and the philosophers, they would think about this a lot. They would say that sort of all of life is fluid, that we're constantly going through these different phases. There's the paradox called the ship of Theseus. And basically what it's saying is you take this great ship from this Athenian general, and it was a warship, and they preserve it as a sort of a monument to this great naval captain. But over time, they replace it board by board. So one board goes bad, and they replace it. They replace the mast. They replace the icon. They repaint it. So over the centuries, the entire ship is replaced board by board. And so the question then is this the same ship, or is it a totally new or different ship? There's an argument you can make. Given the staggered terms, let's say in the U.S. Senate, is it actually the same Senate today that it was when America was founded 200 years ago? Right? Is a process that's being replaced member by member, but there is no official point where everything is changed. Where does the changeover happen? So it's not that you're a success because you're successful and a failure because you're a failure, but you're in this constant state of process. Marcus Aurelius is saying, meditate often on the swiftness with which all exists and coming into existence, and that everything is constantly shifting and never stands still. Heraclitus, Marcus Aurelius' famous philosopher, would say, no man steps in the same river twice, because he's not the same man and it is not the same river. So this is the idea that it's this fluid place. And so success doesn't say you're awesome. Failure doesn't say you're awesome. It just is what it is. We're just constantly fluidly transforming from one thing into another. And we won't be in that thing for very long. We won't be in the next thing for very long. This is a famous Roman. He's saying, holding great honors and powers did not exalt my spirits, nor did evil depress them. So at one point he's given a triumph in front of the Roman people, and then he's exiled by the Roman people, and then brought again back to Rome, and he triumphs again. So this idea is that none of this says anything about us. It's just a place that we happen to be. And then you want to think this way because things are going to change, and things are going to go, quote unquote, badly a lot. This is a picture of Thomas Edison's factory in the early 1900s. He sat down for dinner with his family. A man rushes in, and actually he tells him, hey, look, the factory is up in flames. He rushes to the scene, and he finds his life work literally on fire. Two interesting facts. So one, Edison was famous for his experiments with cement, and he built these buildings out of cement. And because he thought the cement was fireproof, he didn't have insurance. So he's literally watching everything he's worked for sort of disappear. And then because he kept all these weird chemicals in the building, it's actually a really strange, surreal fire. It's all these different colors. So he comes to the scene and he finds his son. His son is standing there. His son is shell-shocked. Sort of, what are we going to do? This is horrible. And Edison says famously, he says, go get your mother and all her friends. They'll never see a fire like this again. So he hasn't gone insane, although it might seem that way. He's not happy really that his work is going up in flames, but he is enjoying this sort of strange moment. Right? And what he says to a reporter the next day is like, look, I've been through stuff like this before. It prevents a man from being afflicted with ennui. Basically, it invigorates him. He takes $1 million loan from Henry Ford. And within about 6 weeks, the factory's partially back up and running. By the end of the year, it's sort of fully operational again. And he does quite well that year as well. And it sort of is the final act of Thomas Edison. It's this thing that sort of gets him out of his complacency and sort of puts him back on, a path that he was a builder. He loved building things. And so it actually gives him something to dedicate himself to. But the idea with the Stoics, they call this amor fati, sort of a love of everything that happens, even the bad things, because they prevent their own opportunities in their own way. And then, it's not just accepting the things that happen. It's not just accepting the failures, but loving what they might teach us, what they might sort of put us towards. And if you can do that, if you can see that as this sort of constant transformation, you're actually quite invincible, because it means nothing really bad can ever happen to you. You're always going to be able to move forward. You're always going to be able to say, hey, at least this doesn't make life boring, or at least this gives me something to throw myself into. And then I think the last part about failure, this is the important lesson that I have to think about as a writer, as a creative person as well, is that you're going to put a lot of effort and work into a project, and at a certain point it leaves your hands. It goes out into the world, and you no longer control how other people are going to react to that, right? So one of my favorite novels, I think it's probably the funniest novel of all time, is this book, A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole. It's so funny that Jim Belushi and Will Ferrell, and I believe Ben Stiller have all tried to make it into a movie but couldn't. And anyway, so John Kennedy Toole, he writes this book, he submits it to Simon & Schuster, who is his publisher, and they said, this book is no good, we're not going to publish this. His agent doesn't believe in it, so he's profoundly rejected, and he's so depressed by this rejection, to go to the quote we were just talking about earlier, he's so upset by this rejection that he ends up committing suicide. He commits suicide on a lonely road in Biloxi, Mississippi. He attaches a car hose, or a hose to the exhaust pipe of his car, and he dies. And his mother is distraught. A few years later, she finds this manuscript in a drawer in his desk, and she reads it, and she knows this was his life's work, and she submits it to an editor at Louisiana, or I think it was this Loyola Marymount in New Orleans. This is Walker Percy, who himself is a great writer. Percy immediately recognizes it as the work of genius that it is. He has it published, and the book wins the Pulitzer Prize for fiction that year. So this is my point, that there really is no good or bad. It's just sort of this external situation. So the same book that was rejected by these publishers, who they said it was terrible, he dies, so he doesn't edit it, he does nothing to it. That same book is then heralded as the greatest novel ever, and it wins the Pulitzer Prize. So the idea is you have to be, in some ways, indifferent to these external judgments. This is where the inner scorecard comes in, because there's all these things that you don't control. And if you take other people's judgments as the barometer of success for this thing you threw yourself into, you've now taken your happiness or your sense of self and given it to these people. And let's be honest, a lot of these people are really dumb and really short-sighted. If you think about all the great authors and artists and inventors and thinkers who were rejected, but really were just way ahead of their time, sort of gives you a sense of why you can't let these sort of external measurements decide if something is good or not. Marcus Aurelius is saying, and I love this, he's like, look, we love ourselves more than other people, but we care about other people's opinions about us more than our own. And so if you can flip that, if you can go, I have my own sort of measurements, I have my own criteria for success or quality or anything, then you're going to be much freer. You're going to be much more in control of your own destiny. Goethe is saying what matters to the active man is that they do the right thing. Whether the right thing comes to pass should not bother him. Essentially, let's not focus on whether this ends up having the exact effect that we wanted, but by our own criteria, was it successful? I'll give you an example with my own books. So I put out these 2 books. They sell objectively enough copies to land on the New York Times bestseller list. But then mysteriously the week arrives and they're not there. And it turns out that it's actually a problem with how they were submitted. There's something in publishing called a BISAC. So basically, they don't show up because somebody checked the wrong box on a form, and the books don't show up. So am I going to tell myself that the book is a failure because it doesn't hit this arbitrary, this external scorecard, or am I going to be happy that I did the right thing, I did the right book, I made the right decisions? How am I going to do that? Am I going to see the thing that I worked on for 2 years as a failure because someone else said it didn't meet a random set of criteria? Of course not. That would be insane. And so you see this, though, a lot of people, they go, this wasn't number one, so it's a failure. You're letting other people determine whether you're happy with something that otherwise, before it came out, you thought was great. You thought it was the best that you could do. So you want to measure it by this internal scorecard and not the external one. And then this is Robert Louis Stevenson. It's a sore thing to have labored along and scaled arduous hilltops, and then when all is done, find humanity indifferent to your achievement. But this is going to happen all the time, right? You got to get used to this. This is part of life. What matters is that you're not indifferent to what you've accomplished. What matters is that you know that what you did was the best that you could have done at that moment. This is a much better measurement of success or failure. John Wooden, success is peace of mind, which is a direct result of self-satisfaction in knowing that you made the effort to do your best and to become the best that you were capable of becoming. So he would say, look, obviously he won a lot as a basketball coach, maybe more than almost any other coach. But he would say it wasn't the box score at the end of a game that determined whether it was a good game or not. It was, did they execute the plan that they'd set out to execute? Did they play the game the way they'd practiced to play the game? This is something entirely in your control, and everything else is outside of it. So look, those are the three areas, right? Success, aspiration, and failure. I thought I would give one more sort of last thing that I think the ultimate way to combat ego at all these phases is sort of a constant reminder, which is sort of focusing on the immensity of the world around you. It's very easy to feel like you're the center of the universe if all you're doing is thinking about yourself. This is Glacier Bay in Alaska. John Muir visits in the late 1800s. And he writes this very long paragraph. It's in the book, so I won't try to read it. But he's in the middle of Glacier Bay, and basically what he experiences in this moment is what the philosophers call the infinitesimal point of the immensity. He's feeling the oceanic feeling of connection to all the things that are happening around him. Right? How the waves are interacting with the seaweed and the plankton and the whales and the animals on the hills and the sun. All of these things are in this sort of this vast ecosystem of which him as a human being in a boat is a tiny part of. Right? And he feels in this moment all the obsessions and worldly cares sort of fall away. The reason he helps us create our national parks is to encourage this feeling, to encourage people to go out into nature and feel small and big at the same time. Right? So this is Sedona. I took a picture of. It was very hard to feel self-important looking out over this view. Right? This is my donkey in Austin. Austin is called the city of the Violet Crown. That's the Violet Crown. But sort of standing there looking at this donkey, he's not concerned with what's going on. He has no criteria for what a good day is or a bad day. He has no obligations to speak of, right? Other than existing. His job is to be a donkey, and as long as he does that, it's a good day, right? But humans, we sort of subject ourselves to all this pressure. And of course, ego comes into play then. Here's Buddy with a picture of the book. Also humbling, right, to have your pet eat something that you spent many years working on. This is a line from Seneca. I won't embarrass myself with translation, but basically, the world itself is a huge temple of all the gods. The world is a church, if you think about it this way, and it can humble us and make us aware of the things that are bigger than us. This is there's a park in Texas called Dinosaur National Monument, I believe. You can stand in this footprint in a creek bed that a dinosaur made 110 million years ago. So it's very hard to feel self-important there if you're experiencing the vastness of history, which we can barely comprehend. There was a cool thing on Reddit a few years ago. So I think the vastness of history is interesting, but then also the shortness of history. So they did the math, and they said, and there's some photographic evidence of this and historical documentation, but how many individuals who shook hands with each other does it take to connect Obama and George Washington? You'd think it'd be like 20, 25 people. It's 6. 6 human lives overlapped long enough, and if Queen Elizabeth meets Trump at some point, it'll add another generation. But the idea is that history is much shorter than we think it is, and that all these things that we think are so important are really just a tiny second that don't really matter. This is a crazy video you can watch. I know I don't have much time left, but it's a show called I've Got a Secret. It was a game show in the 50s. Here's this old man. He's on the show. The guest that day is Lucille Ball, and they're guessing his secret. And he starts, he's like, it was scary. She asks if it was historically important, and he says yes. She goes on. And it turns out the man's secret is that he saw John Wilkes Booth shoot Abraham Lincoln as a 5-year-old. So it's crazy to think, we think that the Civil War was so long ago, but in fact, there was a guy who saw Lincoln get assassinated and then was on a game show with the host or with the star of I Love Lucy. And you can now watch this on YouTube, which, as we know, started as a dating site. So it's the absurdity of all this is a little humbling, right? It's hard to feel self-important when you're thinking about these things. But it's also not about making you feel insignificant, but also realizing the connectedness of all these things around us. Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? When you look up at the universe, you feel small, but you also feel big because you're a part of this thing. Not a big part, not the center of it by any means, but you are a part of it. And so when I'm talking about ego, and I'll close with this, I'm not trying to tear anyone down. I'm not trying to make you feel horrible or nothing. What I'm trying to do is show that if you can suppress ego, if you can knock this out of the equation, what it actually opens you up to do, it liberates you to accomplish the big things that you're trying to accomplish without adding. It's like if it's already hard enough to change the world or to start a big company or to write a book or a symphony or whatever you're trying to do, what you don't want is your ego there tagging along trying to make it harder than it already was going to be. So that's the idea. It's not to knock anyone down a peg, but it's to liberate them from ego, which is our enemy, which prevents us from doing the thing that we're trying to do. And so that's it for me. This is Ego is the Enemy, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So if you guys have any questions, you can come line up at the mic. I had one emailed to me, so I can start with that.
All right.
You were just, obviously, Ego is the Enemy is the title of the book, and we talk about how it's the enemy, but aren't there also positive aspects to the ego, like if you lack self-confidence?
Well, I make a big distinction between confidence and ego, right? So I think confidence is important. I say in the book, confidence is earned, ego is not earned. Right? So it's good to be confident. It's good to know what you're good at. It's good to know your strengths and weaknesses. It's good to know what traits you bring to the table. But if we define ego as sort of delusions of grandeur, selfishness, greed, again, all the things that Trump embodies to almost an absurd degree, you see how although this might make you successful in some ways, it sets you up to have a really hard time with that success, right? So again, not to make this about Trump, but you can see how in some ways ego helps him on the campaign because he doesn't think, hey, I'm totally unqualified to be president. Hey, I have no idea what I'm doing. All these things. It propels him into the office because of some ignorance, but then it makes actually holding the office and doing the job extraordinarily difficult. And it's already the hardest job in the world. So ego is Bill Walsh would say ego is when confidence becomes arrogance. And so that's my point. So I think confidence is great, but ego is something different. And there's no positive case for that kind of ego.
Great, thanks.
Hi, my name's Katie.
Hi.
So one of the interesting things that you spoke about was this delusion of grandeur, which is pretty interesting. It actually reminds me a lot of when I watch Shark Tank and a company will come in and they'll say, we're disrupting industry X. And immediately they pan over to Mark Cuban and his eyes roll to the back of his head.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because a lot of times in the startup world, people are trying to balance, saying that they're a disruptor and moving quietly and things like that.
Yeah.
What do you suggest for people who are, working on their own companies and things like that, but trying to stay humble, but also, make a difference?
Yeah, I think the balance there is partly, it's like on the one hand, we're all marketing, we're all sort of building a brand, you're trying to get people on board with a vision, and you want to show, like let's say you're on Shark Tank, you're trying to show the upside, why this is great. I think the problem, and I think the judges always see through this, I think people in general see through it, is when the people have bought their own hype, right? So they're saying these things that are objectively untrue or laughably false or whatever. So what happens, I think, is a lot of times people will start to buy into their own marketing, and that's very dangerous. So what you want to, in some ways, you want to be able to have the duality of this is what we're presenting to the world, this is the story, this is where we're going, but you also have to be a sort of an intense sort of critic of your own self. So I think if you can balance that out, if you can say, look, we present to the world that this is perfect and awesome and going, exactly where we want it to go, but behind closed doors, we're running around trying to fix all the flaws that we know are there that we need to improve. That's one way to do it.
Sure. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Hey man, thanks very much for coming in and investing the time with us. Appreciate it. I'm a big fan.
Thank you.
I'm curious, what started you off in being interested in the philosophy and the Stoics? And do you have a favorite philosopher out of that group, or a quote that you kind of most closely espouse?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I would say part of it is this sort of student mindset. When I was in college and when I was sort of starting my career, I would go to events like this, and I would always ask whoever, like the important people that I would meet, I would always go like, what book changed your life? What book should I should read? And then I would just go and read those books. It's interesting to think. It's like you could, if you only ask people what's a book that changed their life, and you only read those books, that would probably keep you busy for your whole life. And you wouldn't read any crap. You'd only read like books that really help people. And so I was sort of always trying to learn. I was always trying to expose myself to new stuff. I randomly got introduced to the Stoics, which sort of asking that question changed the whole trajectory and course of my life. Not just personally and sort of privately, but also became the thing that I now write and talk about, right? It guides me personally and professionally. So I'm a huge fan of the Stoics. I think, people tend to think of philosophy as like what they didn't like about college, or what only made sense in college. But practical philosophy is what, the Stoics were doing for thousands of years. That the idea was not that you're a philosopher because you lecture in front of people. You're a philosopher because of how you live. I'm really attracted to that idea, and I think there's a lot of benefits there. Hi.
My name is Penny. I'm here in sales.
Oh,
I
awesome.
really appreciate a lot that you have
Thank
to
you.
say, especially those of us, I think, can relate that if you're in sales, you push yourself really hard. And so you tend to judge yourself by the external results
Sure.
as opposed to, that you put in a good day's work. Of
course.
But so I appreciate what you had to say.
Thank you.
I have a question, though, because I have a 12-year-old who already knows everything.
Yeah,
So
sure.
any suggestions
Yeah.
for helping people that already think they know everything?
Yeah.
And maybe my my ego is that I think I have something to offer him. But
Sure.
because I work
Well,
on LinkedIn, right?
No, I think obviously part of that's probably just being 12. I think most of us thought we knew way more than we did when we were 12. And sometimes there's a quote from Plutarch. I think it's in the book, but he's saying, I learned from what I was reading or what people told me, and then when I had experiences, suddenly all those things made sense. So part of it might be, if we're thinking about our own ego, it's like we need them to tell us that they heard us, when it might be better to tell them these things and then understand that it's going to be a process to coming to terms with them. So it's like, what can you expose them to? What can you tell them? And not need to feel the control of knowing they got it right now, but knowing, when they're 18, they're going to experience something, and suddenly what mom told me 8 years ago, or 6 years ago, or whatever, makes complete sense. I get it now. Like the number of things that my parents told me that, suddenly now are like, oh, you were totally right about that, and I was a jerk, when you try to tell me. So I think that's part of it. But I would say one of the things that I think is so hard for young people is like, I'm just on the other side of the generation that didn't have to grow up with social media. It would be so hard to grow up in a world where everything you do and say and think has this sort of objective measure of, internet points on how good it is. And, done a lot of studies that call this the imaginary audience. The reason a 12-year-old thinks that, they can't go to school because they said something embarrassing is that psychologically they think people are paying way more attention to them than they actually are. But what social media does is create a real audience. Psychologists call it the imaginary audience. But now it literally is an audience, So I would also think like, how can you shield them from becoming dependent on these sort of sources of validation that really can become addictions and complete distractions, and maybe focus on some internal measurements as well would be great. Yeah. Hey.
I would hypothesize that certain nationalities, races, and even genders display more ego. And those people that do display in those genders do sometimes show more success compared to people that would necessarily not have those egos. When you introduce the element of time into, say, you've only got a finite time to do things, how do you kind of make that balance between ego being a negative thing and ego being a positive thing? I think especially at LinkedIn, like where we were actually focused on kind of diversity and trying to make sure there's a level playing field and equality. Quite often it's difficult if you don't have that ego, that you don't break through to be successful. And you don't have forever to do those things.
Yeah, so I think the element of time is important. So when you look at, oftentimes I think ego is sort of like, it's like a short-term solution that creates long-term problems. So, if you're, let's say, as I was saying, you're so talented that early on people are tolerating your ego, they're putting up with it, because you're the star performer or whatever. It can lead to problems down the road that you may not even, like, you look at a company like Uber, clearly extraordinarily successful. They did a lot of things that people said you shouldn't be able to do. But the problem is you're learning from that when people tell you shouldn't do something, that they have no idea what they're talking about. And you run past all sorts of criticism and you think that you're winning, but really you're just piling up in the future a more catastrophic kind of failure or difficulty. And so I think part of it is the element of time. I think, but there's that Martin Luther King line, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards truth. Ego might show some short-term benefits, but at the end, we all sort of regress towards that mean. So I think that's part of it. I think people like Marshall are great counterexamples that you can be successful. You can do really impressive things if you don't think about it this way. So that's kind of how I think about it, is that I want to think long-term. And then I also go, just because there's lots of successful people who have egos, doesn't mean the ego is why they were successful. And so we sometimes confuse that causation and correlation. Was Steve Jobs great because he was an asshole, or was he great because he was a great designer? Is Kanye West successful because he has this huge ego, or is it that he's so talented that it compensates for the ego, but at some point that balance will shift, and then the fall is much greater.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey there. I have a question about insecurity and ego. So a lot of what I heard you talking about is kind of combating ego with like logical, kind of philosophical ways. Is there, and in your experience, and I'm curious to hear your perspective on kind of combating some of that ego by focusing on like personal insecurities and kind of where those come from? I'm curious how that would.
What do you mean by personal insecurities?
Kind of like the idea that ego can come from a place where you need to get people's approval to feel like you're enough, essentially.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious where that fits in, kind of on a personal level, as opposed to thinking it as like a philosophical.
No, I think it's interesting. Often the things that we are most sort of egotistical about are the things that we're most insecure about. So it's like, you can almost take the things that people are bragging about as the things that they feel the least secure about. So that's always like sort of a good rule to look at. But one of the things that I think is interesting is like, I get a question. A lot of people go like, okay, I see how some people are way overconfident, causes problems. What about people who are super insecure, that they don't want to do things because they don't have enough ego? But I actually think they're two sides of the same coin. If you talk to someone who's like sort of paralyzed on their couch and they don't want to try or do anything, you talk to them about why, and what they give you is all these reasons. There's very well thought out logical reasons why the game is rigged, why they can't possibly be successful, why it's totally unfair, why you're totally wrong, whatever. On both sides, it's sort of an obsession with self, right? Like imposter syndrome. I think one of the ways I deal with it is I go, people are thinking about me way less than I think that they are, right? Like no one, like imposter syndrome, for people who don't know, is this idea that thinking that you're a fraud and that people are going to catch you and it's going to be really embarrassing. But the reality is nobody is thinking about you at all. No one is thinking about whether you're an imposter or not. They don't care. They're focused on themselves, right? So I think one of the ways that ego and insecurity are related, and maybe one of the ways you deal with it, is to sort of get out of your own head and stop thinking about either. So just you focusing on the work, you're focusing on being busy, you're sort of turning off that voice in your head that's just going on and on about whether you're amazing or whether you're a piece of shit or whatever. You're just turning that off entirely. You're not focused on that, and you're focused on sort of throwing yourselves into the work, the practice, or whatever it is. That's one of the ways to tackle that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What was the catalyst for you that made you decide that this was the book you wanted to write?
So I'd set out, I was interested in writing a book about humility, and I was really interested in it, and I was researching for it, and then this American Apparel stuff happened, and one of the things that I think is really important in creative work, which people don't do right, is that they have their idea for what they think it should be, and they sort of blow past any reservations, any criticism. As I would try to explain the humility concept, it just clearly wasn't resonating, it wasn't working. And so I said, as I was trying to write this book, it wasn't writing. And so I ended up tackling it from the other side. I came at it from ego, which is the opposite of humility. And the book, the idea started to come together. That's the conversation I was telling you about happened. But when somebody tells you that they, and this has happened to me a couple times in life, so it wasn't just this one instance, but when somebody tells you they see something of themselves in you, and then they catastrophically implode in a very public, avoidable way, you sort of go, whoa, I don't want that to happen to me, So part of it was watching someone that I admire and I respect and was very successful lose all the things that they'd worked for. And seeing that historically in my research happen over and over again, I was sort of wanting to not become a statistic, right? Or not, I was successful early in my life. My first book came out, I think I was a best-selling author at like 25. I could see extrapolating out where that was going, that maybe it could end in a similar direction and sort of not wanting to that. And it could still happen. So it's something you work on all the time. Yeah.
So I'm not familiar with Stoicism very much, but when you talked about beginner's mind earlier and a couple other things that brought the kind of Buddhism to my mind, and I was wondering if this is related at all to something like their idea of non-self, where we're constantly making an identity of everything that happens to us, and is that related?
Yeah, so what I think is so a lot of my books are based on Stoic philosophy. I try not to talk about it too much because most people are not interested in philosophy. I just try to sort of present the lessons. But it's very interesting to me to think that Stoicism and Buddhism are two totally independent philosophies that had basically no overlap culturally, are developed at essentially the same time, and they come to the same, with some exceptions, the same sort of fundamental truths about the world. I think that's very interesting. It's almost like two species on different parts of the globe that evolved to have similar adaptations. So I do think there's a lot of connections between Stoicism and Buddhism, and that part of what you see over and over again, whether it's in literature or in philosophy, is that constantly warning that we are our own worst enemy, that failure doesn't come from the outside, but it's things that we invite into our lives, it's problems that we do, it's thinking too much about ourselves, sort of giving into various sort of vices or passions that causes most of the pain and difficulty in our lives. That's what the Buddhists were trying to help people with, and that's also what the Stoics were trying to help people with. So I think it doesn't really matter where you get it from, but if you can come to these same ideas, there's a reason that 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, people were already warning about these problems, and as modern life and technology has taken us in the direction that it's taken us, the same problems exist, but at an even larger scale. And I think you should avail yourself of that wisdom.
Have you seen any issue with, it seems like kind of setting up ego as the enemy here? I've noticed in my own life that anything that I resist or that I'm fighting against just has that much more power over me, because the Buddhists I guess they have an idea of kind of opening to something like ego, to just welcoming it in, and then you can just laugh at it and see how silly it is. Is that a way to kind of combat this?
But I think it's saying the same thing. One is a book title, but the idea is you're bringing it in and laughing at it because it's not a positive force in your life, right? You're not bringing it in and laughing at it because it's amazing and it's helping you. You're trying to tackle it. You're tackling it with scorn as opposed to with sort of logic. But I think we're both saying the same thing, which is that ego is not a positive force in your life, and that whatever you can do to undercut it and undermine it is a recipe for clarity and strength and all these things. So look, I like Stoicism because it was designed for the Western world, and we live in the Western world. We don't live in a monastery, in the hills of Asia. We live in, Marcus Aurelius is the most powerful man in the world. He's Rome, to me, is we live in the world that Rome gave us, not in the world that the samurai gave us, right? So I think in some ways Stoicism is more relevant. I think there's more there. But at the end of the day, they're kind of saying the same thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. want to thank you, Ryan, so much for coming today. Big round of applause. Thank you.